Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 20th episode of By-The-Bywater. Hey, minor milestone there. What do you know? So we are recording this a little before the end of the month, so we can get this to you right at the start of the month, so that way we can just sort of get through the start of next month, and hopefully by the time we give you our next episode to close out the end of the year, everything will be a little more relaxed.
Is something happening in the first week of November?
I don't know. I just don't know. And nobody knows. It's worse than Christmas. But in any event, we wish you the best. We hope for the best. You know all the drill, and we'll say it once more. But we do have an episode to go to, but we will get to it after this because Oriana's completed a move. We are now finally in the same time zone.
Yay!
And Oriana's saying that she and her guy are settling in, and that's good. So what's been your biggest surprise so far about California that you just did not expect now that you're a resident here? Although I think you might have already said that earlier in terms of what you're getting for your apartment.
Well, we had looked at apartments even before we arrived here, and it was still weird to me. You know, we found a place that we will be moving into, hopefully before we record the next episode of this podcast. And it has all these incredible amenities, like a dishwasher and a washer and dryer in the unit, which is something I never thought I would experience ever again. But a bizarre LA thing is, well, first of all, they love their carpet. But also, half the apartments in LA just don't come with fridges.
Nope.
It's not considered an essential amenity. Which, what?
I mean, yeah, no, I'm kind of with you. I mean, having lived in, SoCal for most of my years, on-campus housing and things like this included when I was a grad student, yeah, they provided fridges. When I moved off, there was a house I moved into, shared with some friends for a while, late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, Lord of the Rings film time, who knew? That the fridge came with that, but then I got my apartment on my own, and yeah, that was a kind of that's an extra expense. Great.
It's so weird because, we were thrilled to be, in New York, it's almost impossible to find an apartment without a broker's fee that is attached. They make thousands of dollars just opening the door and then pressuring you to sign the lease for the apartment after giving you 15 seconds to look at it, which is horrible and insane. And I hope that falls out of fashion at some point. But here, we were like, oh, good, no broker's fee. And a fridge is much less expensive than a broker fee. But there's also all sorts of like little fees that they like to tack on.
I remember first hearing about New York City broker fees in the 90s. That's its own adventure, I'm sure. So I was going like, what is this? So anyway, if we do digress into that, we will just talk about any other thing, but we're here for it. Congratulations, you made the move. We're now all up and down the coast. So cue into the west, there,
yep.
And we will move on. So with that all said, it's now time to move on to the news, such news as there is. And there's not much, but we got a few things. So Jared, please, as always, take it away.
Yeah, so there's no major news to report besides the fact that in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern's government won a massive re-election victory due in large part to their continuing success at controlling COVID there. We're all jealous. Again, lessons that can be drawn.
Who knew?
Film and TV productions throughout the country continue to thrive, including Amazon series with J.A. Bayona saying that filming has passed the halfway point. Otherwise, as before, there's no official news, but the cast member with the good quote this time is Ismael Cruz Cordova, who's in a very enjoyable interview covering his work in general that we'll link in the show notes, said, "For Lord of the Rings, I almost traveled to the director's office. I kept hounding my managers to be like, where is he? What part of the role is he in? I did full hair and makeup and costume for one of the meetings. It was exactly what they didn't want, I now know." Yeah, I'm so excited to see him do anything now.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And the other thing is the prospect of nudity in the series became an online thing, and it was exactly as boring as you would expect it to be. So, never mind.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was either people who was like, the very, shall we say, I don't want to say more repressed fans, more certain leaning fans going like,
Tradcath.
Yeah.
All of the Tradcath Lord of the
Dare I
Rings.
say. And then you had all the people going like, who were basically sort of, I think, started with Game of Thrones specifically as their fantasy thing, saying, we want to see them bone. It's like, both of you are living up to your exactly what we expected, and we don't care.
Right?
Oh, God.
There is an argument to be had about how to do this, things like this. It's not happening now. And precisely because it's just a damn rumor. Right. So, yeah, we have nothing to offer. At least I don't. Let me rephrase that. So
I'm seldom opposed to nudity.
Yeah. But the New Zealand news is good. Yeah, Cordova's interview is really, really enjoyable. He seems like just an extremely solid actor. Jared noted, looking it over, that it's wonderful to see an actor who names the chief performances that he really enjoys are by women in a wide variety of films and things. It's sort of like, that's all right, good. There's more of that instead of dudes just celebrating dudes. So, and that may be a good sign for what's going on. And yes, the filming continues. New Zealand continues. Lucky them. But we could say more about that, but there's not much more to say there. I got to give it this much. They are, I'm almost impressed now by how much they have that production locked down. I haven't seen a single, there was like one spy report on the OneRing.net way the heck back in February at the beginning of filming. And even that was kind of not much. And now there's been nothing. If it's out there, they're keeping it. Jeez.
Yeah, there's those photos of the set that are just like the set is walled off by giant like trailers full of dirt or something. It's like a CIA, black site or something.
Yeah. Jeez. I mean, they're making it. It's happening. Productions are occurring. We're going to get something. But yeah, no, I think we'll all be surprised together. Crazy. So, well, there we are. Again, not that much news to share. And who knows, maybe next month will be less. But I do hope we give us one cast member per monthly saying something fun in an interview and all that. That gives us a chance to sort of see where they're coming from bit by bit. So, and nothing against the wonderful Morfydd Clark, but it's great to hear from someone else. So here's to the next one, whoever it is. But beyond that, we will just continue on because we've got a main topic to discuss. It is Oriana's choice of topic, so please lead us on into it.
Yeah, speaking of celebrating women, I guess, I do have to start with kind of an apology to our listeners. I had all these really great intentions, and I packed my copy of Tolkien's letters in a box that only arrived yesterday, and I can't really unpack it because while we found an apartment, we're currently living in a renovated garage, and the cross-country move has kind of been nothing short of Kafkaesque. Did you know you need to have a mailing address to rent a P.O. box? Already, you need to have a mailing address that is valid. PSA, everyone listening, please be on the lookout for fraud associated with Macy's, because someone used my checking account number to set up autopay with them. And I'm not the only person who's had issues. So just this episode is going to be a little less scholarly than I would have liked. So I apologize to the feminist Tolkien scholars who are listening. But Éowyn, Durnhelm, Shield Maiden, Slayer of the Witch King of Angmar, dearer than daughter, she does it all, doesn't she? Perhaps the most indelible image we have in the entirety of Lord of the Rings, or at least certainly most indelible for me, is Éowyn in the Peter Jackson movie facing off against the Lord of the Nazgûl, which is an exceptionally good adaptational change from the book. The language in the book is just a little oblique, whereas in the movie you have this wonderfully simple exchange of, I will kill you if you touch him, and then Lord of the Nazgûl snarls, no man can kill me, and she gets to go, I am no man, and then just kill the crap out of him. It's great. But that's the obvious stuff. What I want to talk about is Éowyn as a person, and is she, against all odds, a character that exhibits feminist ideals? And I say against all odds because we've brought it up before, but Tolkien had some women issues. A few months ago, actually, and this is why I'm bummed that I don't have them handy, but I was reading through Tolkien's letters and I threw the book across the room when I came to one in which he explicitly said that women can never really be as good at academia as men because they are natural, quote unquote, receivers. Boy, I was not happy to read that. That sucks. But throughout his work, we come across these female characters who are so much more than receivers. Plug for our previous episode on Melian the Maya, who is the most powerful person in Middle-earth outside of the great enemy in the Silmarillion. Galadriel, again, who we have also discussed, she blows her purse of a husband out of the water when it comes to intelligence, power, and perception. So there is this sort of wrinkle that these are supernatural women. They're not human, which is why Éowyn is so fascinating to me, because she feels so human at all times. And Jared, as you pointed out, and I think was it about the episode about magic, all of the space that Tolkien gives us. And I feel like there is so much space here to imagine her life watching helplessly as Grima brings Theoden King into his thrall, and as all the people she loves abandon her. You know, her parents have died when she was about 7 or so. Éomer has to leave her to go to war, etc. In the movies, it's implied that Theoden's son, was, I don't know, really important to her. I don't think they were like betrothed or anything, but all of these guys leave her holding the bag, having to do the work of keeping her people together. And Tolkien explicitly acknowledges that in a discussion that she has with Aragorn just before she begs him to take her with him through the paths of the dead. And they have the following exchange that I'm going to read because I think it's so important. Aragorn is trying to convince her that it's an honor to be chosen to stay with her people and to lead them to safety while all the important men go and fight at Helm's Deep. And she goes, "Shall I always be chosen?" she said bitterly. "Shall I always be left behind when the riders depart, to mind the house while they win renown and find food and beds when they return?" "A time may come soon," said he, meaning Aragorn, "when none will return. Then there will be need of valor without renown, for none shall remember the deeds that are done in the last defense of your homes. Yet the deeds will not be less valiant because they are unpraised." And she answered, "All your words are but to say, you are a woman and your part is in the house. But when the men have died in battle and honor, you have leave to be burned in the house, for the men will need it no more. But I am of the house of Eorl, and I am not a serving woman. I can ride and wield blade, and I do not fear either pain or death." "What do you fear, lady?" he asked. "A cage," she said, "to stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of doing great deeds is gone beyond recall or desire." "And yet you counseled me not to adventure on the road that I had chosen, because it is perilous." "So may one counsel the other," she said, "yet I do not bid you flee from peril, but to ride to battle where your sword may win renown and victory. I would not see a thing that is high and excellent cast away needlessly." "Nor would I," he said. "Therefore I say to you, lady, stay, for you have no errand to the south. Neither have those others who go with thee. They go only because they would not be parted from thee, because they love thee." Then she turned and vanished into the night. And what's kind of remarkable about this passage in particular, I think, is that they both are given equal weight. And I find it fascinating that she gets the last word. Now, you know, there is this little turn where Éowyn decides immediately after she'll marry Faramir or after she says she'll marry Faramir, that she'll no longer be a shield maiden and instead be a healer. And I have seen this called by quite a few people unfeminist. You know, this turn is reviewed as a return to a traditionally feminine role of Éowyn kind of hiding her light for the man she's going to marry. But my interpretation of this is that it stems rather from Tolkien's view of war as, to put it bluntly, bad, and people shouldn't do it. And while we don't know everything that Éowyn and Faramir talked about during their 5 whole days together in the Houses of Healing before they decide to get married, he may very well have talked about how he actually has the exact opposite of view of war as Éowyn does. He does not love the sword for its brightness. He doesn't care about glory or renown. And I find it highly plausible, even if this is sort of a fan wank, that Faramir may have indirectly persuaded her that healing, for instance, is a better use of her time and talents than killing. But even more compelling to me is the idea that if she wants to marry him, she finally comes to understand that she doesn't need to run around being a big bad warrior to be loved. Faramir so clearly loves her as she is that she is free to choose who she is rather than throw herself against the bars of a cage to be noticed or mold herself into the same make as her father figure, brother, and, even Aragorn. And there are a few other big important scenes I want to talk about. But first, I kind of want to hear what you guys think. Should we think of Éowyn as sort of a feminist exemplar? And does it matter if that's intentional or unintentional on the part of the author?
Jared, you want to go first?
I think she can be read a couple different ways. Like, I don't necessarily agree that she's not a feminist character because I feel like she's granted a large measure of dignity, even though she is described at one point as sort of like sounding like a little girl in the House of Feelings when she's like, oh, my window doesn't look west or east. Whatever. She has so much inner life. She's treated as a whole person. She's not, she's like the most beautiful person ever, but she's also not really, I feel like, put on a pedestal.
Right.
Like Galadriel and Melian and Luthien are all a little bit on they're all supernatural. They're all like the Virgin Mary sort of thing that Tolkien really liked to do. But she is given a hugely important task, even though she doesn't realize it, of killing the Witch King. And then she gets to say, you know what, I'm done. So she does get to make her own choices. And the fact that they conform to traditional feminine ideals in this specific context, I guess I'm not super bothered because Aragorn is the same. He gets the same sort of choice. He the way that he's a king is that he heals. Her getting to decide, no, I'm going to do that too, is not anti-feminist. Let the man say what's not feminist, but I feel weird making that pronouncement. But just looking at the similarity of her and then again Aragorn and the choices that they make and the way that their stories end in these places of healing is, I think, hugely significant. There's another. I don't know if this is super related to healing, but there was one of his letters. He's talking about how Faramir being Prince of Ithilien is like, it's not really banishment or anything. It's going to be it's a frontier situation for a long time. So she might still get to fight.
Sure.
If that's what you really want out of Éowyn is fighting, she still might get to do it.
It was something I was thinking just now, and Jared's point on board about a guy saying, is a woman feminist or not?
Look, I, a woman, am asking you guys, so you've been given permission.
Well, thank you. No, I just wanted to note that on board. The thing that I would say on that front, I'm trying to take this back to sort of my original encountering of the character, might be the better way to put it. And that was, regrettably, the Rankin Bass Return of the King, which, as I mentioned long time before, is actually my first encounter of anything to do with Lord of the Rings directly. For better or for worse, since basically I was spoiled for the ending when I actually got around to reading it. Oh well. And in that, you pretty much just see her show up and do the exchange and kill the Witch King. Yay. As such, a striking enough design, again, by Rankin Bass, but also carried out by the Topcraft Japanese studio that did the animation for them. It was just, I still remember seeing her in the ad on the TV before it was broadcast. It's sort of whipping off the helmet and just letting the hair flow in the breeze and all that. And it's like, oh, hey, and again, I'm 9, so my perception of such is a little loaded. So advance that maybe over time to when I am more of a teenager and I'm reading the books and I'm getting a sense of it. it's one of those things that, as time has gone on, my understanding of what not merely what is feminism, but what can one say, how is one a woman, how does one identify with that,
Yeah.
especially in the 21st century when these issues become all the more fluid and all the more interesting as a result. And I always have to remind myself, this is a guy from Victorian England and Edwardian
Right.
England writing this thing coming out. So different mindsets, different viewpoints. I would say, however, that if there's something I've noticed is that women written by men as can be taken as role models in very interesting ways by
Mhm.
many people. And so I would say it's one of those things that you can read her fate as potentially being exactly feminist in some very very key readings. You could also read it as sort of an anti-reading, sort of like,
Mhm.
hey, she's giving up this power. So
Yeah.
that makes it sort of an interesting issue. It's one of those things that I myself don't feel like I have the deep knowledge to be able to pronounce definitively. I don't think that's possible, but I think it's one of those things that how people read the character is interesting and gives a lot more possibility than it can to a lot of the other characters. And I think that's very,
Mhm.
very key. She becomes more of an interesting focus point as a result, for the relative uniqueness of her many roles, as you've already outlined.
Yeah, and it's the Faramir turn, I guess,
Mm,
is like there's the passage in which she sort of, well, I'll read the sentence. Faramir tells her he loves her and wants to marry her, and the description is, then the heart of Éowyn changed, or else she at last understood it. And I kind of love that he gives us those two interpretations to choose from.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
But they both make a lot of sense to me. Éowyn is a young woman. I actually looked this up. I was like, oh yeah, how old is she supposed to be? And it seems like she's supposed to be around 24. And I was kind of a mess at 24, and I totally see, like, I don't view that as sort of like, oh, young women, they just don't know what they want until a man tells them. I actually, like, that felt very true to me. It gets at
Mm.
something kind of profound, and I don't see it as sort of Faramir talking her into being into him instead of Aragorn, but kind of, and this is a thing, Faramir is, I guess, around 36 at the time
Mm.
that they get together. I don't care about the age gap thing. That feels like a very Tumblr conversation to be had. We're not going to have that conversation because I think in this case it's fine.
It's such a huge waste of time.
Right? Like, oh, Jesus, guys. But I think it actually, like, it, intentional or not, Tolkien is saying something interesting about the entire life system that Éowyn had around her, that
Mm.
she was so immediately into Aragorn, this older authority figure who is handsome, authoritative, seems like a good guy, and like from the moment, she has a crush on him, essentially. And her, even though she spends most of her time, most of her existence sort of rebelling against this system that has said you're only good for housework or for,
Mhm.
managerial household stuff. I don't think it's a coincidence that she immediately crushes on this guy who is supposed to be the king of Gondor. And it really speaks to the difficulty of operating in a system that you personally cannot dismantle. It
Mhm.
pervades your actions even as you rebel, because Éowyn's shield maidenry in the end is not actually a rebellion against a patriarchal system, but simply her becoming a different part of a different element of it.
Mm.
Whereas her marrying a man who, admittedly, only over 5 days, she has come to know and love, and choosing to be a healer, which is, we just discussed, is kind of a gender neutral occupation in this world, this is her opening the door of her own cage and walking out of it, I
Mm.
feel.
I think it's when you're trying to decide, like, is something feminist or not. Look at what's a happy ending in the setting and who
Mm-hmm.
gets it.
Mhm.
And Sam gets to be a gardener and heal the Shire, and that's an extremely noble thing.
Mhm.
And giving Éowyn the same chance to heal Ithilien,
Mm.
even if she's doing it within a heterosexual marriage or whatever, it's like she's getting the same happy ending that
Yeah.
a lot of the male characters are getting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that it is necessarily bad that it's still within a traditional gender role. It is the same happy ending that the men are getting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not bothered. I'm glad she gets to wield a sword in defense of the world, but she also gets to do other stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same character arc as a lot of other people get. So doesn't have.
It suddenly occurred to me thinking about roles, and this was something in your reading of the initial section about her speaking with Aragorn, that I didn't quite think of it this way until now. So call this a mini revelation. I'm sure it's been talked about. Is the fact that she just simply says, I can ride and wield a blade. You don't know that just by being born. In other words, she was taught. Now, this is just one of two things. First, that Rohan as a culture does this for the women, but it doesn't seem like that's the case given what she's saying. So is it a weird level of royal privilege at play that somebody that close to the throne, those families, they get to do that? Now, I'm not trying to do this in a sense of classism versus this. I mean, we could go down the roads, and the evidence really isn't there, but it's suggestive in its own way that what makes the fact that she is able to do this more unique, and what's behind it. It could be something as simple as, well, maybe a loving brother teaches her, or things like this. These type of things that suggest themselves. Again, they're not spelled out. They don't have to be. They're just one of those things sort of like, oh yeah, I wonder how does that happen? And I think that's very interesting. Another thing that's interesting too, and there's an explanation for this in the story, is that of course we don't have a point of comparison with a equivalent or near equivalent woman in Gondor. And the reason why we don't have that is because in the story, everyone, the women and most of the children have been sent away by the time Pip and Gandalf get there. So in essence, the idea is there was no chance for it to happen. We get a Yorith because she's Yorith and she's her own amazing thing, but she is clearly not meant to be an Éowyn equivalent. So,
I do also wonder if that inadvertently gives us a clear, like a little detail about life in Gondor. Like maybe it does seem like their society is a bit more rigid, perhaps, than Rohan. I think you're totally right that this is sort of a royal family privilege thing. Like, oh, we're going to indulge the, sister daughter and teach her to ride, and if she wants to learn to swing a sword, fine. Whereas I can see, right? Like, oh, those eccentric royals. I was recently listening to the You're Wrong About episodes about Princess Diana, so that's totally in my head right now. But yeah, and you're right, we don't have the equivalent in Gondor, and I think that does give us a sense of the rigidity of Gondor society versus perhaps by necessity Rohan is a little more indulgent of women wanting to do this.
Well, maybe indulgent, but there's something else too to consider, and that's the fact that when we get, and it's always, of course, from Mary's point of view, when we get Mary talking about his adventures with Durnhelm, her pseudonym that she uses when the ride to Gondor happens, and again, it is different from the movie, so we do want to spell this out in the book. It functions differently, and maybe more about that later. Is the fact that, of course, Mary is sort of quietly ignored, by the people he's riding with, sort of like, oh, we know you're there. Arguably, they're doing the same with her as well.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a real sense that they know pretty well who she is. And if that's the case, that introduces a very interesting aspect for it, because are they rebelling against the wishes of their king? Are they more understanding of this? Is this, in fact, seen as less of a chaotic, oh, let's just indulge her, and more like, oh, yeah, no, come on board.
No, she could be useful.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to which I have no answer, but I think it sort of raises, in its own weird little way, it raises interesting possibilities about how to consider the society and her interpretation of it.
Yeah, I totally forgot that there's that moment where Mary is like, there seems to be an understanding between Durnhelm and I forget the commander's name.
I think it's Elfhelm.
Yeah, that sounds right. Of course it's Elfhelm. He's, Mary is clearly the most observant person ever, but he does pick up on the fact that Rohan doesn't necessarily have an issue with them. So it's not, I don't know, we were talking about rebellion. It's not necessarily rebellion. It's like, just the king said no, but there's no the culture isn't saying no.
And that's really very interesting.
But is that because they know that she is Éowyn, or is it because if some other warrior's wife wanted to do this, let's say, would they have been as chill about it? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's not clear.
But even though she is Éowyn, she is part of the royal line and everything, I feel like if it were a big problem, they might be even more desperate to keep her from going.
Yeah.
Right? Because she's important. Whereas if she's just one of the warriors, even if she is royal, then she might get to...
Yeah.
That was kind of a half-formed thought, but that's,
it is also like, who did she... I should know this because I was just rereading it. Who did she leave in charge?
That's never addressed.
I don't. Yeah,
that's a really good question. That's one of those little cunye that maybe Tolkien just.
And it is not information that the story needs by any means, but it is interesting that she does kind of. It is essential to have a person of authority, on the home front. And she's just like, no. But again, I actually thought that she was young, like, maybe 19 or 20. She is a young woman, and impulse control for all young people, not just,
young cis women. I don't know what you're talking about. I was fine at 24.
I had it all figured out.
I knew everything in grad school, yeah. I will say that now that you mentioned about who left in charge, I realized that Tolkien essentially gives the story an out by noting that while there is another invading orc army that's mentioned as heading into Rohan, to Theoden and the Rohirrim get as they're heading towards Minas Tirith, it's sort of like, there's that there, is that it turns out the Ents take care of it.
Yeah.
Which was obviously lucky, because if they didn't, then maybe the question was, thanks for helping us, Éowyn. Why is Edoras a crisp?
Right.
That could have been a question. So
did you guys, I remember being absolutely furious when the theatrical versions totally gave the Éowyn, like, I was like, where's the Éowyn Faramir? Like, because it was so dear to me, because it was, we don't see Aragorn and Arwen's relationship develop at all. And while it is pretty brief, the Éowyn and Faramir courtship-ish, it's just so lovely to me because you really get a sense of these people. Some of it is maybe trauma bonding, but
no, yeah, for sure.
But they do form this wonderful connection that you get to see them form. And I was just totally furious that they didn't include that in the theatrical version of Return of the King.
I feel like that's got to be just the necessities of adapting a fairly dense and esoteric book for broader audiences. She spends some more time with Aragorn, and if they hadn't spent time with them, then people would be like, "Well, why is she with Aragorn?"
Yeah.
They'd keep whining no matter what happens. And if they developed her relationship with Faramir more than just like the few longing glances and the house's feeling that we get in the extended version, then I can see people going, "Well, they didn't. It's so unrealistic. They didn't have enough time." Whereas it's in his letters, he's like, "In my experience, this is how relationships in wartime work." So it's just a more defensible adaptation position, I think, to have more time with Aragorn. But then that makes the ending a little weird. But no.
Yeah, feels truncated for someone who was so important to part of the movie. I mean, it's an impossible position to be in as a director. Like, there's just too much stuff.
They also, all of that being said, I feel like the screenwriters may have been Aragorn and Éowyn shippers, because they included a lot of scenes that weren't, like with the stew, when she makes the stew for him. That's not in the book. They really wanted to set up the love triangle.
Yeah, and they marketed it too. I remember that in at least one of the posters. So the thing I always wondered, frankly, about the stew scene in the extended Two Towers was that when putting together, and of course, reactions. I still remember extended versions were shown in the run-up to the premiere of Return of the King, when they had that one-off all three films showing on the day of release, which of course was great, and was that scene shows them taking the stew, and I remember thinking, where did Éowyn get shrimp? Because it sure looked like there was shrimp in that stew.
Yeah.
Yeah, what sea does Rohan border? Like, what?
I thought the scene was funny the first time I saw it, back when I was a teenager. But now I'm kind of mad because it makes her look a little less competent. And I know not everyone's going to be good at everything, but it feels like a joke at her expense rather than like a potentially loving moment between two characters. Even though he's nice about it and he eats it to make her happy, it's still I don't know, it feels like a weird off-key joke.
Yeah, it's a bit meat's back on the menu, boys.
Yeah.
Like,
Good comparison. I mean, on a functional level, it introduces the idea that, of course, Aragorn is very long-lived and all that, and but that's a bit you don't actually really need for the adaptation. It it just sort of there. Stepping back a bit to get back to the you could say the hospital scene, the house of healing scene, as written. That scene has grown more, the sequences, I should say, have grown more interesting to me with time, because realizing that Tolkien already had his relationship, in other words, he was already, got himself married and got himself set up with Edith and all that, so that was, settled. It seems to be, in a way, I emphasize a way, his way of reading potentially what wartime hospital, I don't want to say romance, but connection could be from his World War I experience. Because it is the case of, I'm not saying that, he directly observed, I very much doubt he directly observed a woman who was shot at the front talking to a guy who was shot at the front. I don't mean in those terms. That's not, I'm not trying to draw a one-to-one. But a sense of when people have been through the grinder. Mm-hmm. And they are trying to find that connection. Quite often that connection can be romantic and doesn't have to be a man and woman either. That sense of reaction and connection, that makes the discussions between the two, because they're both wounded in their own very particular ways. Yeah. And what I think is a very, very elegant touch on Tolkien's part is that they are not wounded the same way. And when I say wounded, I'm not talking about physical trauma. I am clearly talking about the soul, the mental things, how they're reacting to it and where they were coming from. In as much as Faramir seems to be a wiser character, I wouldn't go that far, but I would say Faramir presents an alternate perspective that Éowyn finds herself potentially grasping on. As you were saying, Oriana, this sense of, what is it that causes her to turn, and what exactly that came from. I like, as you say, that ambiguity. And I like that sense that there's no immediate declaration of love or anything like that. He certainly confesses, well, hey, you're hot. Which is, right? Hey, shoot your shot, but
go for it, bro.
But as it were, but to be able to, but there is a sense that they, he emphasizes that even though it's the 5 days, they spent a lot of time talking and thinking, and it isn't something just simply snap your fingers. And that's why I would add that while we focus a lot on the aftermath, when it's sort of like embrace and marriage and it all happens and it's a wonderful moment, it's almost the run-up moment to that moment, because they're realize they got this connection, but they don't know where things are going to go, and it's that we're hanging on the wire moment. That's just sort of like they feel doom surrounding them. They feel like, and it's a very interesting way too, because we already know as readers what's happened. We already know, hey, the ring's been destroyed.
Yeah,
we sort of like, okay, we can pat ourselves on the back. This is great. This is not some sort of intercut thing like a movie edit, dare I say, where we're jumping back and forth, and and everyone's not knowing what it is. Instead, it's sort of like the sense of, okay, how did Far Away react to this? And you get this sense of how all-encompassing the destruction of Sauron is, that they're feeling this from miles and miles and miles away of everything that's happening. This sort of like it's as much a psychic event as it is a physical event, and and to have that connection in the middle of all that is, I think, a very, very deft sort of thing. It's sort of like, we're here facing who knows what. What are we going to do? That's powerful.
We're going to hold hands.
And let our hair stream out together.
I love it. Like, quarantine has turned me into a total cheese ball, and I'm embracing it. It is, Ned, you talking about their very different psychic wounds that kind of complement each other almost. Like, Faramir, his whole life has been spent in his brother's shadow. Éowyn has kind of spent her whole life in feeling as though she has been living in shadow, that she has been constantly not allowed to shine, and she has had to change herself in order to be more like others that she admires. And I find it really encouraging that they get to help each other through their different traumas. They both lost father figures in pretty traumatic ways. But it's the healing power of love. It's so I love it. It's so cheesy. It's just exactly what I need right now.
Yeah.
maybe to throw in another just observation, perhaps, and is that when it comes to royal power, and again, it should be noted that Éowyn is not the daughter of Theowen, of course. She's the sister daughter, if I remember correctly, and is the fact that in both Gondor and in Rohan, we never hear about a ruling queen, of course.
Yeah.
It is, explicitly patriarchal. There's the bit we get from Numenor where there are a couple of ruling queens, but it seemed to be, these always seem to be issues. And so, and this got me to thinking about the closest equivalent to Éowyn anywhere in Tolkien stories for the Third Age. The nearest one I can think of, and I'm terribly sorry I forget her name, but it's not even really equivalent. It's I think the name's Vidugavia, the one that when the kin strife what happens in Gondor, and the idea is that a prince of Gondor goes off to the peoples who are essentially the forefathers of what would become the Rohirrim, like thousands of years back.
Yeah.
So there is a princess there, and a named one falls in love with her, and they have a son, and etc. And the royal line continues from there, not without struggle, of course, and thus the kin strife. But that's the only other one we get, and there's no other sense of anything like that in terms of prominence in the society. To turn it back, though, what makes it interesting about Éowyn is that the concept, she says it, right? It basically says a shield maiden. It's like, oh, they have a concept of these things.
Yeah.
So where does that come from? It's one of those things like, okay, well, what's their understanding of this exactly?
Especially given that when the Rohirrim are carrying Theoden's body into Minas Tirith, Prince Imrahil greets them and is like, "Whoa, what's this? You got a lady here. Do you all do this?" And they're like, "Nah, man. It's just she's great." So it is funny that there is this word for it. But it doesn't seem to happen very often.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of certain, Earth cultures. Like, I think the Mongols did this. I think the Scythians did this, where in certain circumstances, a daughter could functionally be a son. Like, if there were no sons, she would inherit. She would be treated as a man for all intents and purposes. And it was sort of shield maiden kind of thing. I don't think that's the exact word they used, but it's a sort of a similar concept. So I don't know if that's what's going on here, but there is like precedent for an otherwise pretty patriarchal culture to have women who are treated as warriors for whatever reason.
Yeah.
There's also the sense, too, that I think Tolkien manages it actually a pretty good trick here. He sets up the whole riddle of the Witch King. In other words, that, cannot be killed by a living man. And what happens? A hobbit, not a man, provides the initial sort of distracting wound, and then Éowyn finishes him off. And it makes it come clear. In a worse narrative, those two would have only been ciphers to come to that point where they did that and have no other function.
Yeah.
And Merry, to a degree, he's not a cipher, but he's just he learns and grows at his own pace. He and Pippin both in their own experiences, and I think that's that's worth really addressing. In some respects, they're both very heavily in the shadow of Frodo and Sam by default, but they go through their own things even though their experiences are different, which itself is telling. But Éowyn, you don't get a sense that Éowyn is just there to be this figure to resolve this problem.
Yeah.
I'll throw in a random comparison, which may seem very random, but I forget the character's name, but I'm bringing this up for a reason. When Twin Peaks: The Return season happened in 2017, that third season, functionally, of the show, there's a character who is this British guy with a boxing glove or whatever, and he's sort of like, I got this thing and I don't know why I'm here, and then towards the end he fulfills a sort of superhero role and beats up the floating orb and all that, and he's only really there for that. And I've seen more than one criticism going like, what was Lynch thinking with this? This is just this is not really this
never
is
asked that question.
Right?
Never asked what he was thinking.
Yeah, it's sort of like what and all that, and that leads into further discussions about what the end of the series means and all that, and that can go on forever. We are not that podcast, so leave it to other things. But the point is that you can't say Éowyn is that type of character. Éowyn, actually, you get a sense of agency and response. And when Oriana, you were reading that exchange between her and Aragorn, I really got a sense maybe it was hearing it. I really got a sense of the same sort of thing as you did all those episodes ago, where you read Arendis' speech
Yes.
to her daughter. Sort of like, ooh, that's sharper than I remembered. That is. I don't know if you want to run with that, but.
No, that was exactly what I was thinking when I was looking for the past, because I remembered it. I remember all that is to say that all your words are but to say you are a woman and your part is in the house, but when the men have died in battle and honor, you have leave to be burned in the house, for the men will need it no more. That is
get him, girl.
Oh my God. And it shows an awareness and she is sometimes sort of a petulant child-ish, we all are. Not even everyone, but it gives her a seriousness. I would not have expected from, a man who thinks that women can't succeed in academia because they're natural receivers. And that's what's so curious to me is, where does that come from? How does that happen? Is it because it's sort of an imagined world? But you would think that someone who has that attitude would be limited by it and not be able to create a character like that. So it's so strange in a good way.
Yeah, there's always a huge gap. Not always. There's often a huge gap between what he says to other people, like in his letters, especially letters to men. There's a huge gap between what he writes to people that share his views and what he writes in his stories. Which is so weird, and it's not always positive.
Right.
Yeah.
When the imperialism episode read letters where he's like, oh, the British Empire, blah, and then he goes and writes, about Easterlings or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Which is not awesome. That's not great. But there's also these positive examples where he's like, oh, women, whatever. And then writes Éowyn and Galadriel and Melian and Varda.
Yeah.
And Yavanna.
And Arendis even,
Yeah. Or, well, now I feel bad because we did a little episode of this and I forgot, but the dialogue with Finrod.
Andrith.
Andrith,
yes, yes.
Jesus. She's a whole person. She's not just she says something I can't remember exactly. This was a while ago, you guys. Yeah. This sort of women calling people out or ruling realms or doing all this stuff that's not just being, oh, I'm just a receiver. I'm just here to learn from the men. The St. Paul, I do not permit a woman to teach. There's that not happening noticeably. It happens too, but there's also these notable instances where it's not, only a woman could kill the Witch King, and that's not, she's not a passive receptor of anything there.
No, yeah. I may suggest something here. This, again, that suddenly occurred to me. One way we might want to consider Andrith and Arendis as examples here is that they couldn't have happened without Éowyn, because both of them, I believe, were written after Lord of the Rings. You could argue that maybe, it provided him, however unintentionally, with the consideration of Pekin, and maybe in those later years, for all those attitudes, however late they were expressed, change can happen in interesting ways to people. I say this personally, just thinking about people I know who I won't name in my life, and who have gone through things, and and I certainly believe I have too. Sometimes quicker, sometimes not. So it's one of those things that maybe there's an answer there. I don't know. But I would say also that besides the other examples mentioned, quite frankly, it could easily be him, and Shieldmane almost gives it away. I mean, all he has to do is he knew his miss. He knew about the Valkyrie.
Yeah.
He knew about Brunhild and other characters fighting in other older folk stories and myths and things like this. There are routes in. It's almost sort of like he did not have any model, but he did apply it in a particular way. And again, that's an area that I don't pretend, to know the depths of the research and what's available and how that's properly conceived. So, but just an observation. And also, he knew his British history, even though she seems to have been a bit of a constructed figure, and I'm going to be mispronouncing her name. Bodicia, the warrior queen of early Britain, who, again, much different circumstances. The story's kind of brutal, but the idea of a warrior queen is not unknown to British history.
No.
So there you go.
Even Morgan Le Fay, I mean, she's but I don't think she began as a much reviled sort of sorceress, or maybe.
Oh, it definitely depends on who's telling the story.
Okay, I thought that was one of those Rashomon type.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many versions of the Arthur stories, and in some of them Guinevere is like the baddest, and other ones she's just like misguided, and some of them Morgan Le Fay is just like the king's sister, and other ones she is the king's sister, but she's trying to kill everybody. It's just the agenda of the writer.
Yeah.
Very transparently in some cases.
Yeah.
Absolutely true there. Yeah, trying to think. I think one of the other things too is that Tolkien allows her to be a very interesting. This is going to sound strange. Basically, allows her to be the emphasis of some striking moments of depiction. Let's put it that way. For instance, when she comes out the doors of Edoras in the mail, just sort of standing there. That's one of those like. I mean, that's just a beautiful moment. It's like, whoa. Granted, the movie took a different course, therefore we didn't get that moment. That would have been amazing to see in Two Towers if they had stuck to a more traditional, more straight down the line retelling of the story.
Although that's more of a costume. Like, we do get a moment where Éowyn is standing alone on, like, just outside Edoras. She's not in mail or anything, but it is this sort of helicopter drone crane shot.
Yeah, the shot where they sort of come in.
That's such a great shot.
It's so beautiful, and I love that. Continue. Sorry.
No worries. The other
She's
thing
very picturesque.
The only thing I was going to say is this involves someone who, of course, worked on the movies, and that's why they hired him, and that's Alan Lee. And that in the illustrated Lord of the Rings from '92, the cup of parting moment that happens between Aragorn and Éowyn is directly illustrated, and that's interesting because it does have them on this equal level, you could say, kind of the way you were describing, Oriana, and that's striking to see. Lee has said before that his choices of what to illustrate. We're sort of, I don't want to say they sort of programmatically divided up the book, or however the idea is, okay, it's at this page, therefore I will illustrate this, what's on this page type thing. But it was close to that. It was something close to that. So in some respects, it was luck that meant he ended up with that particular scene. But it's great because it does give her a sense that you do get a sense of equals. And I think that's a very striking moment as a result.
And, that actually brings me to something that I had not noticed until now, like this time going through and really paying attention, where Éowyn very quickly begins to refer to Aragorn as Aragorn. She calls him, she's like, Aragorn, will you do that, blah, blah, blah. And it's this sort of interesting immediate familiarity that you would not have expected, but there it is. But it's almost, and she doesn't have that with Faramir. She keeps saying "my lord," and then there's one my friend. So it's I don't really know what to make of that. It's just like, huh. Well, it was like, was she trying to force familiarity onto Aragorn because she had a crush? And then she kind of learned from that with Faramir.
Men want to be called my lord.
I don't know, right? Like, I'm just going to call all dudes my lord from now on, like, to kind of guard against rejection.
And thinking again of a visual moment for the story is the bit in the book where it is before Merry meets Durnhelm, and he's out there riding along, and he notices a young warrior at the end of the line, and this face of, it's almost like a pale face of death, not fear, but just sort of like just cold commitment, and it's very striking. And that, of course, is Éowyn as Durnhelm, and again, openly there, and that's led to comments. It's in one of the commentaries for the Lord of the Rings film, so it's something like, how could Merry not have noticed? He must be a very stupid hobbit. So, and again, it works in the book. It's just this thing that's sort of like you accept it and go with it. But still, depicting it would have been hard. I understand the route they did. It was more immediate,
impossible.
More fun.
Yeah.
But again, it's sort of like and it's notably that he gives her these striking moments in this militarized context, and not just that, of course. Thus, the hair blowing together moment on the walls of Minas Tirith. He seems to know how to use her in a weird way. He almost lets her represent, someone who is there to fight, but is still very, very afraid. And that is a look he must have seen himself more than once when he was serving, and probably felt it too. So
yeah, it is interesting that he gives that to a female character.
Yeah.
Who knows?
In conclusion, Tolkien and women, a land of contrasts.
Yeah. What else do you need to say, really?
Like, as with so many other topics that we've covered, there is this, like, deep level of nuance here where it's like, and I love talking about it.
All right. right, so we now look ahead to our next episode, which will be the final one of the calendar year here, and that comes around to Jared's. Jared, it is your choice of topic. What are we talking about?
Since it's, coming to the end of the year, I would talk about the Christmas letters.
Yay!
Can I confess I haven't actually read them, so I get to read them for the first time.
I mean, we will talk about this, but I find them the actual text a little cutesy and annoying, but he did so much art for them that's actually really lovely. So it's going to be a fun time.
And it's just fun. We'll talk about this more, just to basically see how he takes out. It's a classic Tolkien example of taking a small idea and then it grows. And I will say it's also really nice to see some of the letters themselves when I went to the Tolkien exhibition at the Morgan in New York last year. That was really, really lovely. So, yes,
Beautiful.
It'll be a perfect end of the year thing, a perfect way to celebrate Yule in its own particular way. So the Father Christmas letters to help wrap up this year. That's a nice way to wrap it up.
Yeah. That is one thing, like, the Hobbits celebrate Yule, and that's always been a thing that I'm like, hold on a second, what?
Well, yeah, because Yule is just the midwinter festival in pagan England. So
yeah, they can get away with it. So they don't have Santa Claus. We hope they don't have Santa Claus. If they had Santa Claus without that we Father Christmas is a Narnia thing. So that's what
that drove Tolkien crazy when he showed up. He was like, "Why?
What is this?
Why is this in Narnia?"
Well, maybe we should save that for the episode. So, we'll do that. We'll do that for next time. So we will get you that episode at maybe the end of November, more likely start of December, but we'll get it to you, and then we'll all be hopefully in a happier place. So anyway, with that said, by the time you get this episode, we'll be moving on hopefully into some sort of new world. We'll find out what. And on that note, we thank you again for listening. As always, contact information and more in our outro. Be sure to listen to us next time. Keep spreading the word, rate and review us, the whole 9 yards. Until next time, we'll talk to you then. Thanks very much. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.